Hi, this is Colin Talbot again, talking to some colleagues, this time in the United States of America, about how various governments are responding to the COVID-19 crisis. As most of you probably know, America at the moment has the highest, unfortunately, death toll of any country, with over 16,000 people having died, and particularly New York State and New York City being very badly hit. So we're going to talk this evening with Beryl Radin, who's in New York, I think. No? Where are you? In Washington, Beryl?
In DC.
You're in DC, okay. And Jane Fountain and Al Roberts. So would you just like to kick off by just introducing yourselves briefly for people who are watching?
You want me to
Beryl,
start?
do you want to go first?
Sure. I define myself as a pracademic, and I'm somebody who has been in and out of the world of practice and in and out of the academy, and I have my work has focused on policy analysis, performance issues, and increasingly federalism questions. And so that's how I look at what we're about to talk about.
Thanks, Beryl. Jane?
Hello, my name is Jane Fountain. I'm a professor at the University of Massachusetts School of Public Policy and in political science. And my work has been primarily at the intersection of complex organizations or institutions and how they use or misuse or fail to use primarily new information and communication technologies. I've been interested for almost the past 10 years in cross-agency collaboration, and I think COVID, maybe we'll get to this a little bit more later, and climate change are really pushing the frontiers of how we think about these collaborative and partnership efforts in organizational terms.
Thanks, Jane. Al?
I'm Al Roberts. I'm one of Jane's colleagues at UMass Amherst, and I'm a professor of political science and public policy and also director of the School of Public Policy here at UMass Amherst. And I just published a book called Strategies for Governing, Reinventing Public Administration for a Dangerous Century.
Yeah, very apposite title, I think. Okay, if we could get going. I think it would be useful for, this is going to mainly go out to a British and international audience, so it would be really worthwhile if one of you could just give us a quick 101 on American, the structure of American government. I mean, perhaps, Beryl, you mentioned the issue of federalism. Maybe you could just explain for people who are watching about the different levels of government, and then we can get into how they've responded to the COVID crisis.
Well, I mean, there are two things I guess people need to always keep in mind. One is that the US has shared powers between the three branches of government, so that unlike a parliamentary system, there's not a prime minister or president doesn't have control over the budget, over policy, and for a number of things. And the second thing that I think is the relationship between the central government and the states. And there are many different forms of federal systems, and the American system, it probably has examples of all of the different forms, but that's clearly a player in what we've experienced in the last 2 months.
Do either Jane or Al want to add anything to that?
I would add to that something that our British colleagues, certainly the political scientists, know, but others might not know, which is that in our federal agencies, what you would call ministries, the top 4 layers or so are political appointees. So our permanent civil service, our top civil servants do not go as high up in the ministries as those do in England, in Great Britain.
And I think I would just throw in that foreign observers sometimes think that the United States is more centralized than it actually is. That's a highly decentralized system. There was a scholar who wrote 100 years ago, Frederick Jackson Turner, who said that the United States is like Europe. It's a group of nations, and there's sort of a diplomatic effort that goes on in Washington. And when you're looking at the response to the crisis, in some ways, unfortunately, what you're seeing is a group of nations that is within the United States that are reacting in different ways, just as nations within the European Union are reacting in different ways with different degrees of success.
I would just throw in one other thing, is that although there is this tension between the central government and the states differ from each other tremendously. And so it's hard, we can't generalize about the states. And that's one of the things that's occurred in this episode.
Yeah. Okay. Well, could we go back to just talk about the federal level to start with, because that's the main thing we certainly see outside of the United States is the reaction of the Trump administration. And can we just explore for a moment how well prepared they were at the federal level? Because there's been a lot of debate in different countries about to what degree governments were prepared for some sort of pandemic like this. One of the first interviews in this series was with Clay Westcott, who worked for the Asian Development Bank in 2003 when they had the SARS crisis. And Clay had quite a lot to say about why some of the East Asian countries seemed much better prepared as a result of that, whereas many Western countries seem to have been caught not very terribly well prepared. So can you say something about how prepared the US was at the federal government level?
Could I just step back a minute and really suggest that we begin with the broad question, which is, what have we learned in the fields of public policy and public administration that might be relevant to dealing with this situation? And I emphasize this because I think that this issue, this life and death issue, is both different and similar to what we've experienced in other issues. And it's very hard to sort that out. We focus on the specifics of tasks that are related to achieving goals, but we also need to pay attention to the way that these issues operate in a broader setting where other issues and experiences are involved. And policy people call this topic implementation. And most policies are thought to operate in a context that's really somewhat predictable, but it also touches on many different behaviors. We need to give attention to the uniqueness of a specific situation or crisis that requires new ideas, but we also have to think about how others are affected by it. And so the balance between the new and the old is messy and very hard to explain. And to me, the major problem that was built into this situation was the failure to look at the context in which any policy dealing with this issue had to be implemented. It wasn't a tabula rasa situation. In this case, the failure to use the transition process from Obama to Trump opened up major problems. And I've been struck by Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk, which focused on the experience showing that Trump's staff actually, by design, failed to look at the materials that were created for them by the Obama staff. And Obama had invested in the transition process because he appreciated the materials that Bush had left for him. So he was trying to give back to a Republican what he had approved from that. So failing to ignore past experience might be appropriate in a setting where democratic values are not built into structures and processes. But in the US and in other democracies, these values make the conflict between the new policy and the context really inevitable. So I think we'll probably talk about a number of things, because I think that dynamic really led to a number of things, ignoring both scientific and institutional expertise, failing to seek new information, using a style of communication that was filibustering, defensive, and making over promises. And we never, in our testing, the little that occurred, differentiated between victims or carriers. And yet that is so basic to this. And so I think we're getting into this, trying to dig ourselves out of a hole that we created for ourselves.
Thanks, Beryl. That's very interesting. I've just been reading the Michael Lewis book myself, and some of the accounts of the transition process are truly horrifying in terms of the way that the Trump people simply didn't turn up. Jane or Al, did you want to add something to that? Obviously, I think people here will be intrigued as to why the American government seemed to have been so badly prepared for this and in denial at the beginning of the process.
Yes, and let me add directly building on what Beryl has said, the experience in the U.S., I won't go back as far as SARS, although the U.S. did learn from that experience, but H1N1 and then Ebola did lead the previous administration to do some very careful planning. And in addition to plans to produce simulations, and let me add to this that although natural, events like Hurricane Katrina, which was a disastrous event, are different from pandemics and epidemics. They are similar in the sense that they expose either careful preparation or lack of preparation. They are cataclysmic events by definition. They require many, many different agencies and units to be able to act together. And I would also add, so after Hurricane Katrina, the United States government and country was made well aware of our lack of preparation. We put in place more preparation. We certainly didn't do it perfectly, but began to require municipal governments, state governments, FEMA to have better preparedness plans, disaster mitigation plans. 9/11 was another occasion, September 11th, without going too far off on a tangent, but this category of intermittent, very highly consequential events that seem to burst upon the scene, but which are somewhat predictable. We don't know when they will happen, but countries know that they will happen, and governments, administrative states must be prepared for them. Anyway, last year, from January to August 2019, the US Department of Health and Human Services was actually leading a simulation called Crimson Contagion on a pandemic that was very similar to this one. It had begun in China. It was carried by a traveler, although let me say parenthetically, we are now learning that at least in New York, the carriers were from Europe, not China.
Yeah.
And this involved 12 different federal agencies, about a dozen different states, major nonprofits, the Red Cross, etc. It was quite a sophisticated simulation. It had been part of this carryover from 2017. But these are bureaucrats deep down in the bowels of the bureaucracy carrying this out. They created an extensive report, which I have up on my desktop right now. And many of the things that they found, their key findings, were quite similar to what we see. States competing with one another for equipment, confusion between the federal role and the state role, agencies at the federal level competing about who would be in charge of what, cities and states acting independently, and they've specified and detailed many, many more breakdowns. So the issue, one issue, again, building on what Beryl has said, is planners do these things all the time. The thing is how you connect what good bureaucrats are doing with what executive decision makers have available or decide that they will have available for these crises.
I think that's very interesting. Sorry, Beryl, can you just hang on for a second?
Yeah.
I think that's very interesting because it's almost an exact parallel to what happened in the United Kingdom. They had a disaster, a pandemic planning exercise. It was built around an influenza outbreak rather than something like this. About 3 years ago, it was conducted largely by officials without very much political involvement. It led to a whole series of conclusions about where the gaps were in terms of things like supplies that needed to be stockpiled and plans that needed to be put in place. And the former permanent head of the civil service, Gus O'Donnell, just last week admitted that they'd done all this excellent planning work and then done nothing about putting in place operational means for making that happen to address the problems that had been identified. Could I just see if Al wants to come in at this point?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that the response to the current crisis has been aggravated by the distinctive incompetence of this president and his advisors. But there is, when you look at it more broadly, a pattern here. You know, we had the 9/11 attacks, a catastrophe of 20 years ago. And then immediately after the 9/11 attacks, there was this observation, well, you know, we could have seen this coming. I think the expression at the time was that the warning lights were flashing red. And then we had the global financial crisis and its American manifestation. And then immediately after the financial crisis, people were saying, well, you know, there were signs that this was coming. The warning lights were flashing. And here we have yet another instance in which the warning lights were flashing. And so there's a question about, is there a broader structural problem here? And you could say, is this just a defect of democracies? Is it a defect of the way that the American system is set up? Or is it a defect of the way that the mentality of rule in the neoliberal age? Is it just our failure to recognize that you have to build in, you know, you can't run everything leanly. You have to build in resilience. You have to plan. You have to anticipate and budget for catastrophe. So I think there's sort of bigger questions to be looked at too.
I stopped you before, Beryl. Go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to Jane's comments, because I think it was really very ironic to me that the agency that was put on, appeared on many of the 6 p.m. press conferences that the president had was usually FEMA,
Sorry, could you just explain who FEMA is for people who are not familiar with that?
Emergency Management Agency, the one that totally screwed up Katrina. The agency, I mean, everything they did was a problem. Almost, I mean, I'm not exaggerating. And yet they are the ones that were brought to the podium to talk about their capabilities. And, you know, it was really quite perverse to think about how that process, who decided to make that decision, and yet, you know, from even little things, by buying the wrong trailers that people couldn't live in, and they didn't know how to do procurement, and yet they're the ones that are viewed as the experienced agency. So it's very depressing.
Can I just ask about the relationship between the federal government and the states? Because certainly one of the things we're talking about here, and we'll be doing some work on this later on, is that one of the usual reactions of the British state in any crisis is to centralise everything. And very often it doesn't go back to being decentralized after the crisis is over either. And certainly that's been the reaction here. So there's been a lot of really big initiatives from central government, but a lot less of good coordination on the ground by local government in our case. and some tensions between, we don't have a federal system, but we do have devolved governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and there's been some tensions between them. Literally today there was a bust up between the Welsh government and the government in Whitehall over what's been going on. I just wondered how far there's been tensions both between the federal government and, as was mentioned earlier on, tensions between the states, with states trying to monopolise equipment or keep it to themselves or not cooperating properly. Who'd like to come in?
I'll keep going if you don't. One of the problems is that at least the theory of federalism is that you have equal players, even though they're different, and so that you're trying to figure out ways for people's differences to become part of their strength, and to bring information to bear that otherwise wouldn't have been heard. Now, we heard in the last couple of weeks, New York State, California, New Jersey, Washington, all were states that could serve as, because they were relatively early too, that people could learn from their experience. But the way they were perceived by the White House was that they were crossing their lines, and they were meant to be the secondary players. And so instead of being equals, they were subordinates. And the procurement decisions were really incredible about trying to make the states feel more subservient about it. And then there's another thing that, I mean, that sort of is kind of similar to the UK's focus on local government. That in a number of states, there is a lot of differentiation between parts of the state. So you have, you might have the northern part of the state having one kind of political culture, and a southern part and having a different approach. And so the governor is sort of caught in the middle there. And that's why it's been very hard to get consistent policies that really cut across the entire country.
Okay, can I see if Jane or Al want to come in on that? So Jane first.
Try to tick a few things off. Relationships between the 50 states in the United States, if you think of it, I'm not a game theorist, but I think this is a good example for game theory. First of all, there is real scarcity. So it's not just a matter of getting the equipment to the right place at the right time. I mean, there is true scarcity. And as most of the governors, or many of the governors of the states know very well, only the president, only the federal level can invoke the Defense Production Act to force firms to produce more or to produce what is needed. And the president was quite reluctant to do that. But it was clear to most everybody that the markets were not going to produce what was needed. Supply was not going to rise to meet demand. The prices are crazy. So no way that markets could clear this in the time needed. The other thing I think that's worth mentioning is that there are wonderful companies and businesses, all over the United States. They are in global markets, most of them. So 3M had outstanding orders from countries all over the globe. Yeah. And they had commitments to send those things out. The president, again, could, and federal legislature, but not states, could say, no, you are not allowed to export those things. So we have these international perturbations, if you will, as well. Recently, a group of states, many of the leaders or the early states that Beryl mentioned, have started to form an alliance. So again, sort of game theoretic, they can keep competing with one another, or they can say, let's work together. Not all 50 are working together, I'm sure, but many of them, especially the larger states, the ones that have recognized that they will be hard hit, are figuring out timing. I would imagine you have this across the UK or in England as well. Some places are being hit very hard. We're calling them hotspots here right now. They need equipment right now. We know that other areas will need that equipment in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks. And so the plans are made to move things around. But states are doing this kind of coordination on the fly. They're making it up in real time based on the relationships that they have forged. I mean, they've known of one another. We have governors' councils, etc. But the specific working relationships around this are being forged pretty much in real time. So it's what do we call it? It's a mess. Things are getting better. I don't know what the situation is with respect to governors from states that have been very slow to take action, that do not want to recognize this still as a serious epidemic, that do not want to issue stay-at-home orders. I think they are operating in a different world. And again, this goes back to Beryl's comments about we have very different states politically, historically, etc. And it will be interesting when we look across them.
Can I pick up on that and ask a question to Al? Because yesterday I did an interview with a group of colleagues from Canada. And as Al hails from Canada, he might be able to say something about the comparison. One of the things that they said, which I thought was really interesting, was that although the outbreak in Canada started in British Columbia, they jumped on it very hard at the beginning and have quite successfully contained the spread of the virus, and they've had a very low death rate compared to Ontario and Quebec, the more populous provinces, which didn't react to the fact that it was in Canada, even though Toronto had the SARS outbreak back in 2003. And as a result, they've got more than 10 times the death rates in those provinces that they've had in British Columbia. I wondered if you could say something about that, Al, about the comparisons. Your audio's off, I think, Al.
Well, 2 points. I hope my aging brain remembers them. But the first is just on the U.S. versus Canada. My hunch is that Canada overall, even though it's also a federal state, is probably handling the crisis more adeptly than the United States is overall. And that's for a combination of different reasons. It's somewhat different structure of federalism, but also different structures at the federal and provincial levels, parliamentary systems versus separation, the American version of separation of powers, and also political culture. But I just think that one of the virtues of the Canadian system is it's better at handling predicaments like this. In the American case, we've actually got, I was just thinking as Jane was talking, we've, as she says, a wide variety of states. We've got states, think of it in 2 dimensions, predisposition to act and actual capacity. We've got states that have relatively decent capacity and a predisposition to act. New York, California, Massachusetts, and they're frustrated at the moment because the federal government isn't helping them out. We've got states that have a predisposition to act in very poor capacity, like Louisiana. And then we've got the other states where there's a very low predisposition to act and probably low capacity too. A lot of states where they're very slow to move. The question is, what do you do about those states where the political leadership or the political system is structured in a way that the leadership is just not acting with sufficient alacrity to the circumstances? Is the solution in that case for the federal government basically to take in and to move them forward, or do you recognize state sovereignty?
Yeah, okay. I think we're going to have to pull it to a close because we've run slightly over time already. I don't know if you heard the clapping just now, but we have 8 o'clock in UK time. We have the people going out on the street to applaud the healthcare workers. It was quite noisy here for me. I don't know whether you heard it, but that's become a standard practice. I don't know if that sort of thing's happening in the US yet. It's certainly happening around Europe in quite a few countries. Is there any final, just brief comments from any of you that you want to make before we close this? I'm sure this won't be the last time we'll be having this sort of conversation. And one of the other things we're going to try and do is set up some international dialogues with slightly larger groups of people to talk about the lessons to be drawn across international borders. So if we could just go round. Beryl, is there anything final you wanted to add?
I think I would really like to know what explains the reluctance to invest in testing, and what there is in the U.S. culture that really kept it took a long time to really acknowledge that.
I think that's true of the UK as well. I don't know if you know, but they were incredibly slow to get testing off the ground, and they actually stopped testing in the community and only testing people in hospital until very recently. For about a month, they were only testing people in hospital. So our data about how far the virus is spread is incredibly weak. Jane, was there something final?
On a sort of related but different topic, I hope that you in your future interviews will look at data collection and privacy. Many of the countries that are seen to have been successful have gathered lots of data about contagion with others, possibly through phone contacts or location data. And many of us are concerned about privacy and puzzling over this trade-off between individual level privacy and the kind of data you could collect that could help epidemiologically.
That's I just want to say that's particularly problematic in Israel.
Can I just say that you'll be interested in the interviews I'm going to do next week, Jane, in Denmark, because the contact from Denmark came from a large IT company, a Danish company that's working with the government, and the two big changes they're bringing in are, first of all, a telephone app to allow people to contact trace who they've been near if they've got the virus. And the other is that they're setting up a national registration scheme where everybody can use their government ID to log in and regularly report whether they've got symptoms or not, so they can do better mapping. But of course, there are all the privacy issues. Different political culture in Denmark, and that's less problematic there. Al, finally, would you like to add anything before we close?
Yeah, two quick points. The first is just to follow on my earlier comment that I suspect that in terms of immediate response, the real story or thing we ought to be focusing on here is the shortfalls in state capacity. But putting aside the response, the public health response, the other thing that's really interesting here is that we are undertaking a really extraordinary experiment in which we are deliberately shutting down a continent-wide economy. And we're doing it consciously because we believe we have the toolkit to revive the economy, which when you think about it is just an extraordinary thing. That's one of the capacities that we have that makes it possible to respond to this crisis that a lot of other countries don't. So it's an extraordinary experiment in policy, basically. Shut it down and start it back up again.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see what happens in countries that don't have that capacity, what's happening particularly in India at the moment.
Exactly.
It's going to unfold, I think, in very unhappy ways in the next few months. Well, thank you, all three of you, for joining me and having a fascinating discussion. As I say, I'm sure we'll be in touch again very soon. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop recording now.